So firstly, a very warm welcome to tonight's event. I'm Laura Broderick, the Commercial Partnerships Manager here at the Building Centre, and I'm delighted to be your host for tonight's event, Retrofit Meets Estates. So tonight's event is a panel discussion after a series of presentations. It's part of our Retrofit 23 programme. I hope some of you have had some time this evening to look around the exhibition upstairs. If you haven't, there will be a bit of time later on after tonight's presentations and discussion. So do take the time to go upstairs and look around. So the exhibition is very much focusing on residential retrofit and towards deep retrofit of homes at scale. So the talk series that we've been putting on, the Retrofit Meets in-person events here at the Building Centre, and then our online lunchtime talks, very much respond to that theme and some of the issues that we need to explore as built environment professionals and audiences today. So, some housekeeping notices before we get started. If you could all kindly turn off your phones or put them on silent, that would be much appreciated. We have no planned fire alarms, fire tests, so if you do hear an alarm, it will be a case of evacuating the building, obviously out the exit door here, and then I will lead you through to our nearest fire exit round to the right. So yes, if you do hear the alarm, please respond in good, appropriate measures. So just about tonight then, while you're here to hear the presentations, we're going to be hearing from 3 architects and an engineer. I've got a bad joke here. I was like, it's a bit like a new film title. Don't know if anyone would want to go and watch it, but you're here today, so you probably would. So we've got some fantastic presentations, approaches to retrofit of estates, examples from London projects. We'll be hearing about Becontree, Carpenters and Gascoigne Estate. The projects will be presented in turn for about 20 minutes each, and then after each presentation, we'll move on to the next, and then we'll get everybody up together for the panel discussion at the end, and we'll be opening questions, and so you as our audience can please put them to the speakers at that point rather than between the presentations. A little bit about our speakers this evening, so just in turn of order of presentations tonight. So we have Mellis Haward, a director of Archio Architects, leading on a number of the practice's housing and community projects, including the London Community Land Trust project in Lewisham and Angel Yard intergenerational co-housing in Norwich, and that's with Developer Town. Mellis has a particular interest in community engagement, and the practice's co-design model for Becontree Estate is actually on display upstairs in the Retrofit 23 exhibition. We're delighted Mellis could join us, and she's also a member of various design review panels and is an active part of the architecture community. Next up, we'll be hearing from Harrison Simmons, an associate at Procter & Matthews. He joined the practice in 2017 and has since worked on a variety of projects from strategic master planning in South Thamesmead to designing and detailing individual buildings, including the flagship office for Homes England. Harris's interests in architecture span from the macro to the micro, jumping across all scales of intervention to large-scale city planning to the design and detailing of individual homes. And then Linda Teal is a partner and architect at White Architecture and the founder of their London studio. With over 20 years' experience, her work has embodied a Scandinavian approach to designing homes and neighbourhoods to meet the growing challenge of urbanisation. Linda's career and upbringing in Stockholm, combined with her experience of working in the UK, give her a unique perspective on the urgent need to reevaluate how our homes are designed and built. Linda will be co-presenting with Gareth Atkinson, an engineer and urbanist directing Civic Engineers London studio. He leads on civil and structural engineering for projects ranging from sustainable retrofit and extension of existing buildings to large-scale regeneration and public realm improvement schemes. Gareth sits on the NLA's Net Zero expert panel and is a strong advocate of sustainable design and helps with implementation Civic Engineers' climate charter across their projects. We also have apologies from Amandeep Singh from Be First, who unfortunately is no longer able to well, he might have enjoyed it, to join this evening's presentations in the panel discussion. So, a fantastic lineup of speakers. I'm looking forward to hearing more about their projects. So we're going to start with Mellis. So we'll be inviting Mellis up on the stage to talk about the Becontree estate. As I said, it's also featured in our exhibition upstairs. So can we welcome Mellis to the stage?
Thank you so much, Laura. I am going to get ready. Okay, I'm ready. Thank you. So, my name's Mellis. I'm a director at Archio, and I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction to our practice, but before I do, I want to introduce you to Ade, who's the woman in the middle of this picture. She's a member of our Becontree Estate Residents Forum, and when we met her last year, she told us how she's living in a house that's overcrowded, it's damp, and it's just too expensive to heat. She wants to start to retrofit her house, but she doesn't know how to begin, and our ambition is to work with people like her to help her overcome those initial hurdles. So we're a 9-person practice founded 10 years ago, and we have a very much a people-led approach, which led us to work with really interesting values-led clients and community-led housing groups, such as Citizens House, which is the first purpose-built community land trust in London. We're part of a big collaborative team of a new neighbourhood in Lewes called the Phoenix, and the project Laura mentioned, this co-housing scheme in Norwich, just resubmitting some elevations today. I'm feeling like quite emotional about this project now because it's going through a very long planning process. Anyway, the point of showing you those pictures was you might have noticed that there's pictures of projects on all of those, but also there's pictures of people, and the people who are our clients or those that we work with or we speak with. And that's because at Archio we work really hard to lead the industry conversation on co-design and on collaboration. Oh, look, my team have just arrived. Hi, so sorry to embarrass you. Anyway, we really care about collaboration and co-design because we think that to solve really big, complex problems, and to make positive change, you have to understand the user experience and those issues really firsthand. So that is, in a sense, the essence of what we do and our approach. So retrofit of existing housing stock, I'm just going to put this here, is one of those really complex and vital issues. And we were particularly interested to read, actually, a couple of years ago, about this huge potential of the scale of retrofit in UK's interwar housing stock. There was an article and a report by the RIBA on these topics. So it was really, and we were really interested because we were already working in the Becontree estate, which is the largest social housing estate, apparently, in the world, 29,000 homes. It covers the majority, 40% of Barking and Dagenham's households. And it was built between the wars over 14 years by the LCC, and this is what it looked like in the 1930s. This is what it looks like now. This is actually an aerial photograph taken by one of our residents' design group, Kirk, and you can see it's pretty similar, bar quite a lot of below par rear extensions, a lot of oversurfacing of front gardens, etc. So back to Ade, who's there again in the picture. We met her as part of this residents' design group that we formed in relation to a retrofit strategy project that we had been commissioned to undertake. And when we met with her and residents like her, her experience of housing reflected many of the problems that we're all working to address. The housing crisis means that many people who need homes are struggling to find them. This is actually an article of people queuing on her road for a prospective house. And also, like all of us, she's facing rising fuel bills, and these maps of Barking and Dagenham, which show the estate mapped with a dark line in the middle, which shows like how much of the estate it covers of the whole borough. It shows a correlation between low EPC rating, fuel poverty, and low health outcomes. And, you know, I'm preaching to the converted here, but poor housing costs the NHS a huge amount, and damp and mould, we know, contribute to those poor health outcomes and a big issue for housing providers and housing owners. So when we started this commission to look at a retrofit strategy for this huge estate, we also took a step back and thought, do we really want to bamboozle people with ideas of retrofit and heat loss and insulation, all these topics that we knew statistically were not familiar to them? So instead, we made 3 models of the 3 very typical house types in the estate. So there are 14 house types, and 3 of them cover 70-ish% of all the homes. So the scale of getting a retrofit answer right and it percolating to a huge amount of homes was extraordinary. But what we started with was talking about what's your experience of your home? Where is it overcrowded, or where do you enjoy it? Where is it damp? Where is it? What's the condition of living there? So we were sort of starting the conversation, not saying, you know, what are your heating bills and how do you want to retrofit your home? Because it's not a concept that necessarily people are thinking about every day. They're just thinking about how they experience their home. And we also talked to the maintenance teams at length, and we found that obviously, you know, as predicted, common issues were damp and mold, and that is because when people can't afford to heat their homes and they keep their windows closed, it's a sort of exacerbated cycle of issues. So I'm going to have a couple of graphs here just to show you that it's not just about talking to people. There was a huge amount of technical data behind this. We have Passive House trained people in our office who undertook all this PHP modeling. And this is just a simplified version of the 3 house types and the EPC rating for each of those house types. And we coloured it in with the tenure. So green is owner-occupied homes, pink is privately rented, and yellow is socially rented. And across the estate, it's approximately a third, a third, a third. And what we saw, that actually it was the owner-occupied homes that were the worst performing, most likely because they hadn't had the regular upkeep of local authority or private landlord homes. And so I think it's maybe validated our opinion that we should be talking to owner-occupiers first, because it felt like, in a way, the smaller of all the big hurdles in order to get started on retrofit. Because we know that private landlords, aren't we, through conversation, not massively motivated. I know that the government is going to absolutely renege on their promise of wanting EPCC, is it, for private? And I'll come back to that maybe in the Q&A. But it really felt like we should start with talking about private ownership homes. And we were backed up by reading the Skidmore Review, published earlier this year, that identified that at least of half the policies in the government's net zero strategy rely on personal action. So let's start there. So even if people in the majority are motivated to take action, and these are some of the group, we always had, for each home, we had someone who was privately owned, renting, or landlords, social rent. But what we found is that even if they're motivated, they often lacked the agency, the access to affordable solutions, the confidence in those solutions, the trust, just knowing when to start. Even as somebody who's just started to try and retrofit my own home, it's taken me 2 years to get going, because it's really, really hard to know what the first step is, to move all your furniture out of the way, to find the right person to do it, to buy the right stuff, you know, even if you know what you're doing. So, but like I said earlier, we felt that particular opportunity at Becontree came from this sheer scale and the fact that there were only these 3 designs. So we really honed into the particularity of each of those houses. And I guess what we knew is that the technical solution to each of these homes would not be enough. We have to get these people on board and understand their issues. So we undertook lots of co-design workshops talking about their priorities. And Ade, for instance, who I introduced earlier, she wants to reduce her fuel bills, but she was really obsessed to have an air source heat pump from day one. And it took us a couple of weeks to find out why, and it's because her neighbour has one. And I think that's quite telling. I think we're kind of advocates for groundswell of like neighbourhood-led retrofit, because I think that once you see your neighbour do something, and it's a house that's similar to yours, it's familiar, it is more likely to kick you into action than having quite general ideas on retrofit, and that's very much at the centre of what we have done here. And this is the model. It's in the exhibition upstairs. And we wanted to make the models really beautifully so that the residents started to build trust, that we knew about their specific home, and that we had really understood what their home required. And also it helped to talk very technically about retrofit. And we have a whole series of videos describing different retrofit solutions. But even doing a slice through the house here, none of the residents knew that they had air under their floorboards. No one, unless it's the kind of thing you're familiar with, you wouldn't know that you could put insulation under your floorboards. It just wasn't something any of them were familiar with. So alongside all that, we measured a number of different retrofit solutions, and the baseline energy demand of an existing home in PHPP, calibrating it with the EPC data for that house type, And we benchmarked it against all the energy usage and national average. All I mean to say is we produced all these graphs for Be First, so they have a pure, good set of asset review information of their estate, but we absolutely did not show that to the residents because it would be totally bamboozling. So instead, we produced very simple diagrams like this that show like the percentage of heat loss in different parts of your house. And I think that really started to sort of take them on a journey of where they could retrofit themselves. There are obviously lots of technical challenges with this because the passive house modelling assumes that residents keep their homes at a very average 20 degrees temperature, which is not the case. But, you know, we have to make our best efforts as we go. And then topics came out, such as how do we set an appropriate energy price when we don't know what's happening with energy prices if we're talking about payback periods, knowing that some retrofit measures have really short payback periods and some long. And we sort of did a lot of work into this, and then residents said, it's not really that we care about. We just want to know if our house is worth more if we've done the work. So in a way, they helped us define what we were measuring and targeting. And that's now become the next, if Amandeep were here, he would tell you about the next piece of work we're looking at, about how we're getting more data on that so that we can sort of fill people with confidence that it would add value to their homes. Although, frankly, that was a month ago, and now who knows. So what we were ultimately drawing out was a pathway to a net zero home. And I think where we got to was that we needed to create a retrofit solution that enabled a net zero home, air source heat pump ready, etc. But we had to get there, first of all, with some easy wins. Nobody we met there was going to employ a retrofit coordinator and do the whole hog. We had to start with describing some easy wins and their payback and how they would be overcome. And we also combined, so I mean, I could tell you that what we understood in terms to be cost neutral, in terms of annual fuel bills over a sort of 15-year period, you add cavity wall insulation, loft insulation, subfloor insulation. That was the sort of basic, maybe some window seals. But it was quite straightforward stuff, really, in a way. The easy wins were quite straightforward. The other thing we had one eye on is that most of the people we met were more motivated to spend money on extending their really quite small homes than on retrofitting their homes. The homes are built in the 1940s, and the kitchens are really designed for one housewife to like carefully make dinner on her own. It's just not the reality of people living in their homes. So we produced I mean, this is a very simple drawing, but a extension and adaptation guide that is now being subsumed into the Be First's design codes, planning design codes for adaptation and extension, so that we're sort of removing another hurdle to retrofitting your home. And we're showing residents how if you do retrofit and extension at the same time, you save X percentage of the building cost of doing the two together. And that is basically me. I don't know if I've been too short or too long, but there you go. All I was to say is that with over 1 million homes of exactly the same interwar housing typology, I think this scale of potential impact is huge. And I also think that I've been meeting with lots of people who are working to, let's say, impose retrofit on their tenants and on their neighborhoods, and they're getting a lot of refusals. They go all this way to the end of finding a solution, and lots of people don't have the trust and are not taking up this incredible offer, actually. And so I think that understanding people's issues of trust, the hurdles towards them doing it, taking it up, is really fundamental if we're going to kind of build this groundswell of neighborhood-led retrofit, which I think is really fundamental. That's me.
Well, thank you so much, Mellis. Hold your questions for the Q&A session, because we're going to do all the presentations and then do the discussion. So next up we have Harrison. So Harrison, if you'd like to come and take the stage. So welcome to Harrison.
Mellis, thank you very much. I think it's quite interesting because we've probably got quite a lot of similarities between what you guys have done in Becontree and what we've got on Carpenters here. So it'd be interesting to see how those relate. So today's conversation is about the Carpenters Estate, which is the major East London regeneration project near Stratford. And the story of Carpenters has been going on for a really long time now. But today we really want to focus about the project since 2019, when we started working on the emerging master plan and the first phase, and the way that the residents have shaped the work and the retrofit that will take place over the next 15 years. I suppose one of the key kind of themes of today's conversation is how we can discuss some of the buildings that have been retrofitted, but also ways which we've looked at the existing kind of heritage of the estate and how we can work with the existing spaces and the existing framework and bring other ways of retrofit into the master plan. So this is a very complex project with a very big team. It's been led by Popular Living, which is London Borough of Newham's development arm. And they're the lead client and organisation that's taking it forward. Tibbalds is the lead planner, and then it's got Metropolitan Workshops and ourselves as the lead master planners, and then ECD architects who are retrofit experts, and ourselves working on the first phase, which is an existing building retrofit. So this is the first project, the first phase. So this takes an existing tower within Carpenters and puts forward new refurbished homes, as well as taking an existing community centre, which is on the northern side of Carpenters over here, which is the Docklands facility, into a state-of-the-art community centre at the base of the building. And this was granted planning permission in spring 2022, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. And then the master plan is the kind of wider estate regeneration, which includes up to 2,000 new and refurbished dwellings. And this has been developed through a process of co-design with existing residents. And this is currently in the planning determination period. The master plan includes parameter plans setting out things like access, building massing, heights, landscape arrangements and land use, and accompanied by design code, and then a design and access statement which has an illustrative master plan accompanied with it. So the context is really interesting. So it's right next to the Olympic Park and all the amazing developments that are happening within the area. There's a new Stratford train station entrance going into the northern side of Carpenter's estate, which is going to completely change the way people use and visit the estate. So it'll completely change how people particularly get to the new developments that are happening within the south of Carpenters. And you can see JRP nestled within the centre here. The estate itself is a kind of mix of modernist and Radburn city planning. So it's got things like backs facing out onto key routes and key green spaces, a clustering of mixed-use shops within a kind of neighbourhood focus at the centre of the scheme. And it's predominantly kind of 2 to 3 rise housing and flats with 3 high-rise towers, which are identified in red there, that are located across the site. And these kind of sit within their own spaces of grassland, so you can see the kind of grass which these come out of. And they're built in a kind of modernist Corbusian style, but very little of the kind of architectural expression. There's a series of workplaces and business units that occupy the kind of western side of the site, adjacent to the railway. The Carpenters Dockland Centre, which is the community centre that I talked about earlier, which is going at the base of the first phase, a building crafts college, and also a school as well. So really it's kind of got everything alongside. Also, have I just lost the mic? No. I'll keep on going. Hopefully you can. Oh, back. So really, with those mix of uses, it's got absolutely everything that makes it a kind of 15-minute neighbourhood. So it's a really kind of key piece of cityscape. It's got a really interesting heritage from being marshland back in the 1700s, going through a period of industry in the 1800s, to then a kind of mix of industry and housing in the 1900s, which then became quite overpolluted. And led to the estate redevelopment in the 1960s. And this has been used to inform the development of the master plan going forward, particularly the way that we've thought about the kind of movement strategy. And what's really interesting about Carpenters is the sense of community that's been on the estate all this time. And through this process of the master plan, we've worked with residents to really kind of understand what works with their estate. And it's been really interesting talking to people, going through kind of history archiving, things like that. And we've met people that have lived on the estate for a very long time that actually remember the estate before the 1960s redevelopment. and how they remember this new estate coming along and actually really kind of transforming their lives so people could kind of live within state-of-the-art apartments within new kind of parkland and areas of amenity. So this made a kind of real community, which has slowly been lost over the years. So since 2000, there's been a number of development attempts, and these looked at completely kind of clearing the estate with the existing infrastructure and replacing it with new uses and new residents. And from there, although none of these development attempts were succeeded, there's been a gradual process of decant since 2005, which has led to the deterioration of the existing fabric. And so, while the estate is so kind of close to the Olympic Park and that legacy, none of that has kind of been given onto carpenters, and so it's been quite cut off and disconnected. But in 2018, a new direction was established, and one which very much put the residents first to inform the future of their estate. And so in 2019, we started this process of engaging the residents, and this led to a resident brief. And part of this process looked at various different levels of intervention. So the images that you can see on the bottom left there are conversations that we used, or drawings that we used with the residents to discuss what sort of intervention they wanted on the estate, whether it was quite a low-rise solution or more of a kind of mid-rise solution, which actually could provide more amenity space, more uses, more grassland, more parkland, and all that sort of thing. So this led to the resident brief, and then from 2020, the master plan was appointed, or the master plan team was appointed, which led to the project that we've been working on over the last few years. So we've done a lot of our engagement from the Dovetail, which is an on-site engagement hub. And this has really kind of set the kind of creative engagement process, using model making, using kind of interactive ways of workshops, of gathering ideas, gaining consensus and understanding the parameters of the estate. And it's been a very gradual process over time, but eventually we've kind of gained trust with the residents. And in 2021, residents voted in favour of the ballot, so that gave us the consensus to develop the master plan, and we submitted that in the summer of last year. So in contrary to all the other developments that came before this work, we really wanted to work with what's there. So this kind of goes back to the historic maps that we talked about before, so looking at the legacy of movement, looking at those historic routes and overlapping and interweaving the kind of new movement patterns that would come as a result of the station on the northern side of Carpenters. Thinking about the existing fabric on the estate and trying to work out what can be retained and refurbished and brought up to 20th century standards. And there was all sorts of condition surveys done on various different buildings around the estate, and it was these buildings in red here on the second diagram that you can see were the ones that we determined that were going to be kept and retained as part of the heritage of existing fabric. And this then kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier about the resident fondness for these buildings. They remember how they lifted them from the deprivation of the Victorian terraced housing. And so it kind of gives a kind of real mix of old and new through the master plan. And then thinking about the diversity of uses, so thinking about the residential uses, thinking about the educational uses, and thinking about ways that they can be rehabilitated and put within new structures that better suit their location and function within the new master plan framework. And then also thinking about the existing green spaces, so expanding the existing public spaces at the centre of the scheme and thinking about how we can keep the biodiversity, keep those spaces so it kind of gives a memory of place. And so what we've got is, or what we've really tried to work hard to achieve is this real piece of London. So in total we've got around 2,200 new and refurbished homes, of which 50% are genuinely affordable. 304 of those are existing dwellings that have been refurbished. And then alongside that, it's got all the local open space requirements, public open space, and the mix of non-residential employment, education, and community spaces that bring together that real piece of London. And this is one of our 3D sketches that explores the massing. So what we've tried to do, and this is all kind of responding, this has all been developed through consultation with residents, is build a kind of higher rise perimeter of carpenters that together with the buildings along Stratford High Street creates this kind of silhouette identifying and celebrating the boundaries of the estate. And by building high here, it then relieves the centre of the estate for lower rise family housing that's kind of nestled around a neighbourhood green. And this diagram starts to pick up on those key movement routes as well. So that key route from the New Stratford train station entrance through the estate along a kind of mixed-use high street, taking people down to the south and back over towards the Olympic Park as well. And all this kind of brings out those real pieces of London. So we've got tranquil garden parks. So this is a view of that neighbourhood green with the lower rise family housing located around that. And you can see the kind of perimeter, higher rise perimeter that together with the buildings along Stratford High Street creates that silhouette of carpenters. And then we've got intergenerational building clusters. So this includes kind of smaller flats, duplexes, and also houses that support later living, starter homes, as well as family housing. So you can really get lots of different people living within one of those urban blocks. And this is one of the kind of key things that we think London's all about, is that you get these shifting scales and these shifting blocks that make it a really interesting and diverse place to live in. We have mixed-use streets, so kind of bringing all those other uses that we talked about in Carpenters before, and making sure that they're rehabilitated in new settings along with the high street. We've got dynamic backlands, so going back to all the kind of creativity and making that Carpenters is, that reflects the heritage of Carpenters, and putting them in new structures that you can see the activity and the interest that happen within these new facilities. We've got intimate residential streets where there's family housing, and then more kind of active urban squares, again with commercial and community uses spilling out and occupying the space. And then a people-focused movement strategy, so really kind of working with those historic routes and spaces and thinking about how we can create a people-focused environment that promotes cycling and walking. So we've got things like delivery hubs that are located in certain locations, so it limits site traffic around the estate. And also thinking about how we have resilient and adaptable homes, and really kind of picking up on some of the key things that residents have asked for, such as being able to kind of identify your own front door and the kind of storage facilities that we've got as well, and flexible living arrangements to suit study spaces and things like that. And how this all kind of comes together over a period of time. So starting with the kind of underused sites, such as the phase 1, which is the existing building, and phase 2, which again encompasses an existing building, and how this then frees up other parts of the development area for kind of higher density housing to suit a range of different needs. So that's a kind of whistle-stop tour of the estate, and I'd quite like to talk about the first phase, which is the existing building retrofit. So this effectively becomes a kind of focus for an evolving community. So it's really about trying to provide some of those community facilities that are going to kickstart the Carpenters community, while also providing the kind of early delivery of housing. And it kind of sets a benchmark for the wider master plan to unfold. So it sets that kind of high quality aspiration. And the idea of doing it as a planning application ahead of the master plan is so that it can come forward and we can start on site as soon as possible. So the existing tower is a kind of 1960s 23-storey tower. So as I said before, it's built in the style of Corbusier, but it doesn't have any of the kind of modelling or interest of its kind of unité inspiration. It's raised off the ground on these giant concrete pilotti, but the result of that means that there's quite kind of blank and underwhelming frontages that kind of surround the streets. As I said, it sits within its own parkland, and we've got some Category A trees that we're retaining and keeping as part of the proposals. And these are just some of the photos that show the building. So it sits within this kind of green parkland, which is very underused and quite underwhelming. And then this is one of the photos from the Undercroft here. So that amazing kind of concrete soffit with those pilottis coming down. But that's the entrance into the building, and it's quite oppressive and it's not particularly welcoming, and it could really be kind of improved and rethought through. And there are a number of reasons why we looked at keeping this building. Firstly, the environmental benefits. So ECD architects, you would be able to explain this a lot better than I can. But effectively, by keeping this building, it allows a 75% reduction in embodied carbon over a new build. So it's got lots of environmental benefits there. We can also improve the thermal performance of this building by taking it up to passive house standards by adding new insulation onto the facade. And there's also the kind of new and enhanced biodiversity benefits that we can do as part of the proposals. And there's also a social significance here as well. And this kind of comes down from speaking to residents around the estate and understanding their fondness for these towers of when they were first built. And so one of the kind of key design ambitions for taking this project forward is to treat the building as a heritage asset so that it reflects the values of 20th century modernism. And this is something that we spoke to residents about quite a few times through doing kind of archiving sessions where we talked to residents about what the aspirations of these buildings were, and how they had, kind of active groundscape. They had interesting kind of modelling, and you could see that see your house from the ground. So that was kind of one of the key things that drove the design forward. And so what we came up with with this landscape of community and sports spaces. So this gives us this kind of undulating floor plate where we've got a series of community spaces while still allowing the kind of transparency through the building. And by putting all these kind of new community spaces at the ground, it really activates the surrounding streetscape. So you've got here a sunken futsal pitch, which people can look down into from the surrounding square. We've got a cafe that spills out onto the street. We've then got ramps and circulation that take people up to the upper ground floor level, where we're using the kind of undercroft of the existing building for flexible studio spaces. We've then got a kind of courtyard space on the other side of the building, which provides a sheltered enclosure for an after-school club. So there's lots of different kind of facilities that go into this ground floor, making it really kind of interesting and active. And this kind of idea translates into the third dimension as well. So what we have here is a series of kind of pavilions that sit at the base of the tower. And each one has this a slightly different form and a different shape that reflects the form and the function of their use. So again, kind of relating back to that idea of 20th century modernism. And each one here is coloured in a way that identifies the different programmes of the building. So we've got red for sports and community uses, green for residential, and then the blue for after-school club and officers' uses. So all this kind of leads to a contextual but vibrant colour palette, reflecting the diversity and the colour that we have within Carpenters. And this all kind of draws inspiration from the Bow Porcelain Factory, which is a 17th century factory that used to occupy the Carpenters, as they all used to occupy, or was nearby the Carpenters estate. And we're also thinking about using ceramics, partly as a kind of link back to that Bow Porcelain pottery, but also because ceramics have a more kind of domestic and human quality to them than other kind of metals and other materials like that. And again, using colour to identify. So this is kind of picking up on some of those Bow Porcelain fragments using reds, blues and greens that relate back to the kind of contextual Bow Porcelain. And then in terms of the tower, there's a kind of simple framing of balconies that goes up the facade that gives it a new kind of proportion, a new depth and modelling. And the idea of framing these balconies goes back to one of those points that we talked about with residents before about being able to kind of identify your home. So by being able to sit within the kind of surrounding landscape and look up and see your kind of home that's kind of framed and given a new expression. The series of kind of intersecting forms, so that wrap of kind of dark grey ceramic that folds into glazing and then folds into kind of transparent areas so you can see the activities that happen beyond into the community centre. And then the different forms of the sports hall and circulation towers that kind of all help to break down what's quite a large programme of activities into a kind of smaller scale, more readable it's all very transparent, so we're maintaining that transparency so you can see through the activities that happen beyond the community centre into the external spaces. And really, I suppose it kind of summarises, it demonstrates a way of how there's lots of these typologies all across London. And a lot of them have similarities where there's kind of blank undercrofts and not a particularly engaging way of sitting within the landscape. And so these new community pavilions can really kind of help activate and engage the surrounding streets. So I think that's it, and we'll leave questions to later.
Hi, I'm Linda Thiel with White Architecture.
Gareth at Civic Engineers, so we'll double up.
See if we can make this work. It's going to be,
you can have the lecture and I'll just stay. I'll stay here. Yeah.
I have this one. So, well, so we've worked together since 2018 on the Gascoigne estate for Be First, and given that sort of all of our experience during those 5 years, we had a conversation at this time last summer, saying. So currently we've kind of delivered 1,200 homes across the estate, new build. We really need to assess what the later phases are going to be. There has been various conversations with various design teams and Be First, like what do we do with the rest of the West? How do we actually progress during sort of on all these different sites? So we basically decided we're going to do this on our own. It's not commissioned by Be First, so this is more our research and almost like presented as a provocation to them, say, why don't you think about it this way when you're going to do your final phases? Just as a background, one of the projects that we did together was also the placemaking strategy. This was commissioned after we had, I'm going to stand over here and point.
We'll keep swapping.
Okay. So we could have jumped ahead. We're embarking Gascoigne Estate. Barking station is up here. This is Gascoigne East. This is Gascoigne West. Very similar to Carpenter's. Used to be terraced houses, very poor. So that was all demolished in the 60s. And it's going to be sort of a nice new 60s estate. The first phase we worked on together was Gascoigne East Phase 2. West Phase 1 had already been delivered by Levitz for L&Q, I think, before Be First was established. This is about 550 units. Henry Hale-Brown have been involved, and Fisher Cheng has been involved with the community centre as well. And then we were commissioned to do, trying to figure out where we are, West Phase 1, which is down here, which was 3 existing low-rise, 3-story buildings, and kind of 50 homes, and we delivered 200 homes on that site. During that time, the Be First team realized we need to have an overall strategy on what happens on this estate. We've got 3 major schools. We've got the Greatfield School, secondary, we've got 2 primary schools here. Lots of pupils and families moving across this estate daily. And with all the construction sites going on, it was also very poorly connected east to west. So trying to really work with the placemaking strategy, finding easy wins in terms of legibility, wayfinding, safer streets, pedestrian-focused and cyclist-focused. And during this time, we had in-depth conversations with very many community groups, residents, trying to understand what their life is on the estate. This is East Phase 2, so here you do see how the new buildings actually do relate to some of the 3-story existing buildings. And this is part of the bit which is not yet master planned and might actually stay like this. And that's a courtyard image from East Phase 2. And this is West Phase 1, which also then relates to the 3-story houses, apartment blocks. So based on that, we said, why don't we assess the sort of 2017, we benchmark against the 2017 master plan, which I think is, this might be the HTA Pippentosa Stitch one, which has since been progressed and developed. But just to get something to compare if we do a full-on retrofit approach, how does that compare in terms of carbon when it comes to a full new build scheme, and comparing the same unit numbers and a different approach? Jump in if I'm like dwelling too much on stuff.
Keep going.
So basically, setting out these 4 steps, like before you start to do anything, assess what you have. Can anything be used? How does that affect the community? Talk to the neighbors and everyone who's involved, and do a really sort of deep analysis of the building structure that you have. Gareth, and you've done like extensive carbon calculations and assessment of the buildings.
That's right. We'll come on to some of those sort of more detailed calculations in a moment. But one of the key conversations which Linda and I were having as part of this was not just about the buildings and the embodied carbon which was contained within those existing buildings, but it's actually within the fabric of the streets and the utilities and the drainage and all those things which are in the original street pattern actually, and how much work goes in and carbon goes in to actually place all of that stuff. And with a lot of estate regeneration, especially when we're knocking down the buildings and rebuilding them and setting up new plans, all of that gets scrapped and has to start again. So actually what we decided to do is, could we create an estate by retrofitting the existing buildings and then putting new buildings in amongst them, but trying to also deliver all the excellent placemaking aspects which you need to do within a regenerated estate.
And also utilising some of the street pattern, which has all of that sort of infrastructure. Yeah, so basically looking, what can we do, how can we add on, what can we extend. This was then, so this started a year ago, which meant that we were looking at sort of infill and 3 additional stories in timber, which has since been sort of scrapped by the GLA. Don't do anything. They don't fund anything in timber. So a bit of rethink when that happened, and then really looking to do like a neighbourhood retrofit approach rather than just sort of a building retrofit approach.
So here are some of the typical buildings. So I'll try and...
Do you want to?
I'll click, but I appreciate some people are looking on that screen as well. So there's typically two building types here. There was actually 4 tower blocks, I think of each of 12 stories each, which you can see on the southern side of the site there. And there was a whole series of 3/4 story low-rise apartment blocks.
Interesting footprints. So they're like linear, and then they have various arms and legs that go out. So that's obviously is complicated when you're trying to achieve courtyards and sort of street patterns and things like that. Come back to that.
And you can see there, this is the southern part of the estates of the last piece. So this was the bit where we got together. It was at a sustainability conference. Some of you may have been to Footprint Plus this year. So it was there. We were having dinner one evening and said, look, we've just got to have a re-look at this because it's not the right thing to do to keep knocking down these buildings. Let's be provocative. Let's actually say, let's retrofit these. So the starting point of that was, right, well, let's start looking at the embodied carbon. What embodied carbon exists within the existing buildings? So a typical tower block on the estate, from our experience of some of the previous stages, there was more of these, which unfortunately have been demolished, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it. So we knew from the analysis of these, for when we understood how they could be taken apart, what the structures were. And what was quite keen about this, actually, was that the facades, the long facades on both sides, weren't load-bearing. All the internal walls,
light blue ones, yeah.
All the internal walls were more load-bearing, and the other aspect is that they've got this kind of H shape, which allowed for some windows on both sides. So you had dual aspect on each side of the building there, but also that gave us an opportunity as well. Linda will come on to that a little bit more in a minute. So what we did is we had a look just at the structure to look at how many tons of carbon were included within these existing buildings, because we felt that was a really important story to tell when you're trying to convince someone you've got to save something, because actually how much carbon exists in your current estate, because actually you own that and that's yours. It doesn't matter what your new building is and how low you try and keep the new building, you already own this too, right? So this is the typical low-rise buildings here, which were typically ground floor slabs, timber floors, or timber roofs and concrete floors. And we estimated how much carbon was in these buildings across all these different types of them across and in between the tower blocks. I think back to you, Linda.
I'll stand here and you can sort of point over there as well. You kind of
I've got the clicker. Tell when to move on.
I mean, appreciate our graphics aren't as they would be if it's been commissioned. This has been done on weekends and evenings. But this is trying to say that basically this is our red line boundary. We're testing two options. So as you might have seen before, the 2017 master plan was just under 600 homes. So that was our starting point. Kind of midway through, we presented this to BFIRST, and they said, well, looks good, but we're actually now assessing an appraisal for 800 homes within this red line boundary, which is very dense, you can imagine. But we started to have a look at kind of the existing street pattern, what streets can we keep. Everything here that's blue is retained, and these red linear blocks are new builds. Trying to shape some kind of courtyards, figuring out where can that fit, what distances will you get between your buildings. And this also then highlighted that we decided to suggest to demolish some of these arms and legs of these three-story houses. The 575-ish option, we suggested to only do a new build which was under 18 meters. So just leaving the towers as, not leaving them as they are, but we didn't add any taller buildings. As you will see later on, when we brought it up to the 800 homes, we obviously had to sort of push the heights on some of the blocks. So this is just a really sort of quick comparison between the existing fabric, the 2017 master plan, sort of roughly 575 homes with the new build red blocks, low rise. And then the option 2 with 800 homes, as you will see, is more sort of fatter blocks in combination with three-story houses, because this was then also done by the time where these two both build on the similar street pattern, because we thought that was really important to also show that it can actually be possible to keep that infrastructure whilst creating sort of a good neighborhood and creating these green streets and parks and courtyards.
So the next thing was beginning to look at what the carbon would be associated with the whole new build development, and working towards, I suppose, what the sort of embodied carbon targets we'd be working with Letty at the moment. I think Gascoigne East, we were up at around about 635 kgs per metre squared. Obviously, we're all trying a lot harder now to get that down lower, so we kind of put together some figures on the basis we thought by the time this got built, hopefully we were getting in around about the 500 mark. But this then began to give us some comparisons of what a new build scheme like this would be compared to a retrofit. So how do we retrofit? And it was really interesting just to see the tower retrofit which you've done. I'm going to ask you tons of questions afterwards. Because one of the key facets is about retrofitting these homes is actually making them better places than what they were currently built as, and trying to meet sort of London plan standards, etc., for space and external space. What was really good about these buildings, as I mentioned before, is the external walls on the long plan actually weren't load-bearing. So actually that gave us an opportunity to take a whole load of load off the building from the foundations, allowing us to do some load balancing potentially by adding on some new lightweight structure in and around the building to provide some additional space, potentially making the flats bigger where they need to be, and also creating spaces for balconies as well. Obviously, doing this enables you to completely encapsulate the building and provide it with a new facade, which is far more thermally efficient as well. So it achieves that too. So there's a couple of options we looked at there on both the low rise and the upper, whether we added an additional story as part of that to provide yourself some additional accommodation, or whether we just went for a simple frame approach, which would just allow for adding some external balcony space. And here are the two kind of options sketched out pretty basically through section.
So, I mean, I think that's kind of important in terms of what the structural integrities of the building, and the piling and everything, and what it's actually calculated to take in terms of loads. And I guess just stripping off the external facades that aren't structural, replacing them with sort of really well-insulated option allows it to add more balconies and other things that way more. So I think another really interesting conversation that we had during this year, and also when we did roundtables with various local authorities and other sort of housing associations, was how do you compare a retrofitted home to a new built home, especially on a place where you're going to provide both? So, I mean, like Gareth mentioned, this H shape, obviously, is really good because we could add a second stair. That's like the first thing to do. There are 12 stories, but sort of add the second stair. And then we took on kind of the extension version where we actually were trying to assess and bring all the different rooms up to current space standards. So all of these, I mean, the width of these rooms aren't to current space standards, so they're like slightly smaller, although the flats are quite big. They don't have any balconies, so that's an easy win. But also, how do we then bring in our really big bathrooms? Potentially, can we, if we strip off the facade, can we slot them in as pods? And how would that fit within this? So just looking at sort of how much do we need to do to actually make it work when you compare it to a new build home? Or is this like the relevant and really good way to make it work, especially since we can work with the facades if we strip them off? So we concluded that these towers have really good bones in a way to actually could work for retrofit. If you can get around sort of the floor to ceiling heights, obviously that's lower, but if you have nice panoramic windows, maybe that's quality.
So here's a beginning of sort of the comparisons we're beginning to look at in terms of retrofit values of embodied carbon compared to new builds. So here we've got the retrofit of just this is including the actual areas of the tower themselves, but the sort of lightweight extensions around the building. Roof terrace, we felt that we can get down to it. This is just the structure, not the whole carbon.
Yeah, this is the structure total.
Structure only,
yeah.
but around about 109, 44 when you put for the low rise. So really quite low values of embodied carbon when you begin to think of it as a retrofit project. And then when you add on the facade and finishes and MEP and so on, the retrofit approach we felt was hopefully coming out around about the 300 kg, which obviously is a lot less than the 600 which we're currently doing for new build or 500 aspiration. If we were allowed to build out of timber, we think that we could get that even less. But at the moment, obviously, that's more of a problem.
But it was quite interesting when we're doing all the internal carbon calculations. You guys did the structure. Sometimes it's extremely difficult to get all the data from the providers, like sapphire balconies. Or, I mean, I'm going to point out, but like, how much carbon do we have in one balcony? It was like they couldn't even answer the question. So I think there's also a long way to go to agree on how we calculate carbon and what tools we use to actually know, like, are we comparing the same data, like compared to the data that you showed, Harrison? I think that's something that we as an industry really need to work hard on.
And here's again, so the option to 800 homes, so the sort of nugget information is at the bottom right there. Once over the entire area for that space, we're looking at for a retrofit plus new build proposals, you're around about 340 kgs. Again, compared to potentially 500 to 600 from just straight new build. And remember, we're not getting rid of the original embodied carbon as well, because we still own that. And it's
you can start on a baseline, which is a lot of embodied carbon already. So I think this is just sort of a very high-level axo showing the different aspects, really taking on a landscape-led approach. So all the assess all the buildings. It's also how does this actually become a really good place? I mean, that is the first thing to do. If it can't deliver a really good place, is it really worth it? So trying to prove 2 points here, and hence calling it a retrofit neighborhood rather than just a building. So all the lessons learned we have from the Gascoigne estate is really sort of improving street legibility, green-blue strategies, programme landscape and new parks. And then, in this case, we then looked at densifying the linear blocks and the refurbishment of the towers. On other phases, we found it really successful to work with townhouses in combination with taller blocks to frame courtyards. And this is also to the very south part, and they already do have some low-rise. It could also relate to the 3-story houses or apartment blocks.
So I think we're on our penultimate slide. So here's some of the, just to talk through some of the potential advantages of adopting this approach. So reuse of existing services, maintaining much of the existing street arrangement will allow for the potential reuse of existing services, particularly underground drainage, existing buried services. Water drainage can be adapted to time with new hardwired green infrastructure and SUDs, which I think is very important when we're looking at the retrofit of any scheme. Getting the green infrastructure in both at street level but also at high level on buildings is really important to help manage the control of surface water and flood risk. Construction speed, although retrofit may require greater on-site labour compared to a new build MMC development, keeping and reusing existing structure will hopefully result in a quicker construction programme. It also might give the opportunity to allow for tenant moval across the state a little bit easier, complete with complete demolition. If you can do one tower at a time, you can potentially actually think about how you locate tenants and move them through.
That's actually quite an interesting thing. On the first few phases on the Gascoigne estate, very few asked for the right to return. But now that more phases have been delivered, especially after West Phase 1, which was one of the first ones that be first sort of handed over, more and more actually asking for the right to return once the new development comes back.
Construction costs, we didn't have a QS in our team. So if
any
QS is in the audience, so I might want to get involved with this. But we've assumed that the cost of retrofit will be less than new build. But you know, the market isn't as mature. It's not the status quo, is it, for a residential approach? So you know, there's going to be implications in terms of how you build these things because it's going to be slightly unique. So cost is a really interesting one to help explore. Existing tenant occupation, I went on to that a little bit too early. So opportunities for tenants to stay in their home during renovation potentially or move between retrofitted towers. Landscape, opportunity to enhance biodiversity, green-blue infrastructure through the landscape retrofit. And then the last thing, which I think is a really key point here, is when you knock down a lot of buildings, that's a lot of intervention and mess and noise for a local neighbourhood, especially a local neighbourhood which is most of it's currently been rebuilt. So the impact of actually doing a retrofit approach, it should have less disruption on the neighbours compared to a full demolition scheme as well.
Yeah, because I mean, these are just a few sort of images from when we did the placemaking strategy, and I think, obviously, like everyone else today, I said Mellis and Harrison as well, it's all about these people that actually, this is their home, this is where they want to go around doing their lives, and they've got children in all these schools. They don't want to be scattered across the borough and might not move back because they want to be able to keep, their friends and families where they are. So that was kind of our provocation to be first, I guess.
Thank you all. I won't take up too much of the airtime because there's lots of people here who will want to ask the questions. But I really enjoyed the projects, but I also really enjoyed the idea of who owns the carbon. I think you said it, Gareth, especially at estates scale. Like, who feels they have to take ownership? Is it like the mayor of Newham, or is it Be First, or is it the individual within a housing block? And I mean, I don't think you need to necessarily respond to that now, but I just think that idea of, especially this panel is about estates, like how do we get everybody on board to feel like they have to take ownership of that carbon and therefore that challenge of reducing it I just kind of, that resonated with me for the scale of the conversation. I know we've got lots of architects in the audience, but it'd be very interesting, obviously, to hear from whoever has a question. If you do have a question and you want a specific person to answer it, please do say so. If you're up for anybody answering, we'll open it just to see who wants to take it. So anybody got a question to get us started? Oh, one here, so.
Thank you. I'm Keith Mandy. I'm Head of Regeneration at Newlon Housing Trust. I'm here with my team and my architect. We're actually embarking upon the regeneration of the Barnsbury estate, which is behind King's Cross and Pancras. We have new build, knockdown, and retrofit. Really interested in the gas, well, interested in everything that we've seen today, but the Gascoigne estate. There are parallels and similarities to what we're doing in that we're embracing the heritage of the low-rise flats, which are Art Deco 1930s. And I'm really interested because we're now seriously looking at our energy strategy to go with that. Interested to know what progress you've made with your own energy strategies, because we're potentially looking at wrap-round insulation, but actually going non-gas and trying to get this as close as we can to net zero carbon and to be as good as what we're potentially doing or are going to be doing on the new build side. Thank you. I think I aimed that at the Gascoigne estate because it seemed to have, I don't know whether my colleagues agree with me, but it seemed to have more similarity to what we're doing, and no disrespect, but it's not a low-rise housing scheme. We are talking low-rise apartment blocks. So, thank you.
I mean, just on that, I think for the, do I need to, or?
I
think mine is starting now. We just need to give them a bit, yeah, I mean, Gareth Structure Engineer, I'm an architect, so we actually didn't have an MEP on this specific project. And also the Gascoigne Estates is quite particular because it's connected to the district heating system, the Barking and Dagenham district heating. But I think had we moved on with that, it would definitely be looking, we as a practice, and I know you do this as well, we look a lot at sort of nature-based materials and nature-based insulation to boost the insulation. Obviously, look at the PHPP sort of passive house standards. And whether we could work with, we do another project together where we do, it's based on air source heat pumps, basically, and then you can take on the approach whether it's like a unitized system for the whole block or whether it's individual, because there are these, I can't remember what they're called, but they can actually do cooling and heating if it's just a unit, which seems to be quite energy efficient and efficient for the home.
That's what we did on Carpenter.
Yeah.
Yeah,
that was the approach that we used on Carpenters for the existing building retrofit. So it's individual air source heat pumps that are based within each flat, and they can also do heating and cooling, as Linda said. There is a district-wide heat network as well, which connects back to the Olympic Park. It's interesting. It's quite a controversial point, actually, because there is a decarbonisation strategy for the Olympic Park, but at the moment it's got quite a long kind of process to it. So actually, if you are looking at kind of thinking about short-term energy solutions that are low carbon, individual air source heat pumps are probably quite a good way to go.
Good luck with the project.
Yeah. We'll be back next year for
next at the back corner. Yeah.
Thanks. I've got a couple of questions for Mellis. Really interesting. I sort of just wanted to know what happened next in terms of how contractors were chosen. If there was a sort of, I like the story about one neighbour having their air source heat pump and the sort of next person. Was it the same for sort of builders? Was there a sort of framework that they were chosen off? And I suppose the second thing I wanted to ask was whether the sort of connection you've got with that community now, whether that opens up a possibility for more enhanced POE work, which is often very difficult.
So what's happened next is that we have reviewing the strategy and before they completely adopt it. So it's only completed fairly recently. But what the conversation brought out of that was also a conversation with the council saying, if this is going to happen, we need to bring the labour force quite local. You need to see the benefits locally. And so we're in conversations with the technical college about how they could bring retrofit contracting skills at quite an early stage, because we're talking about this taking place over 20 years, so people training in construction now in Barking and Dagenham should be thinking about this massive opportunity in Barking and Dagenham. So there's a wider conversation happening there. Also, what's happening next is we've designed one particular home that's an empty home of a type A home to a kind of stage 3 full retrofit, and that's going through the kind of QS systems at the moment. I mean, as in it's being costed, and we're trying to work out whether it's going to happen. And I think what we're interested in terms of what's next is how could there be I know there are some really interesting retrofit homes across London, like the Waltham Forest Eco Home, but it's like one example, and then it was handed over to someone. And we're interested in maybe how could there be a whole system of retrofit of houses across the estate where they get used as kind of showcases, you try different strategies, people then move into them, and they become the POE. So, you know, after a year of someone living there, you find out what's worked, what's not worked, and you keep retrofitting at least the Be First owned homes across the estate so that you keep learning what's working well.
Great. Thank you for the question. Next up is a lady at the back.
Hello. Thank you, everybody. That was really interesting. I've just got a question for Linda and Gareth. I was just kind of interested in the feedback you got from Be First on your study, because as I understand it, they're proceeding on the basis of a new build strategy. Was it purely density that made that? I appreciate you're not in their heads. You don't know ultimately why they made that decision. But I'd be interested in any commentary you got.
It's really interesting. They were really engaging when we came to them with this. We'd got about halfway through the study and said, guess what? By the way, this is what carbon you've got in these buildings, and we think there's another way. And they were like, really? Okay, let's hear about it. And we presented it to them in quite an open forum. And we then tested it out around a bit of a round table as well. They'd be very kind to let us present this tonight, because they would, they could say, actually, we don't want you telling anyone about us looking at our estate in this way, but they're being incredibly open about it. And as far as I'm aware, they've actually seriously considered it to a certain extent. I don't know what goes on behind closed doors because we're not there. So it might give them a little bit of a problem in changing the tack of where they were thinking, and maybe they're too far down the line already. But if not here, then it might be the next one, And it's all about this sort of education process as we go through. Just ourselves carrying out the study and doing this taught us a great deal about understanding what these existing buildings are and just thinking about them more differently. The forum we've got here tonight, and everyone listening and hopefully nodding and agreeing a little bit that actually, we shouldn't go knocking things down to start with. So they've been very receptive. We don't know where they're going to go with it. Maybe other people in the audience might. But
No, but I think, like you said, they were just doing the final appraisals for phase 4 in Gascoigne. So they threw this one in the mix, and I think we just had to appreciate that it was very late in the day, and they had sort of progressed quite far with the other study and decisions. But I think they definitely said that this is we always have to assess our sites in this way when we go forward, in a way.
Brilliant. Thank you. Question at the front.
Hi there, Alice Brown. Is that working? Thanks very much, everyone. That was really interesting. I've got an observation and a question. My observation is that it's not so much the existing embodied carbon in structures that's the issue. It's the future carbon emissions that will result from new construction that we can reduce through doing retrofit. So that's just one comment on your presentation. My question for Harrison is, with your very nice tower refurbishment, I think you managed to retrofit about 7% of the existing estate. To what extent did you really look at the other buildings, the other 93% of the buildings, to see whether or not they could be retrofitted?
it's a very good question. Yeah, thank you. And it's a process that we've talked residents through. So back in 2019, we did a whole series of kind of capacity testing, where we looked at different levels of intervention across the estate. So it looked at a very kind of low impact, so just using the existing fabric and retrofitting that and seeing where that would get us. And then to different kind of levels of intervention where it'd be completely cleared and we'd start again. And through the conversation, we let them kind of vote on their preferred option, whether it was, low intervention or high intervention. And they kind of voted towards the kind of middle end, so the kind of mid intervention to high intervention. And the reason for them kind of doing that was partly because the amount of, through more housing that can be provided, the additional kind of green spaces and extra amenities that they. That was the kind of real, that's what they voted for in the end, and that's what we kind of started to develop. I think if we were to have that conversation now, we might kind of re-look at the extent of retrofit, that piecemeal approach of bringing in more existing buildings. But I think taking principles, and I think that's where the work that White and Gareth has done on the work in Be First. It's really interesting because you managed to get it to work there. But I think in the case of Carpenters, where there was lots of there's a kind of movement strategy that didn't quite work. There's lots of kind of unwelcoming spaces that could be improved upon. In the end, allowed us to kind of relook at a lot of those things. And it's a really interesting question. I'm not saying that we've completely got it right in Carpenters. I think it'd be really interesting to kind of look back and see if there's anything else that we could do. But yeah, that was the kind of thought process behind that.
Can I pick up on your observation? Important to tell people how much embodied carbon is within their existing buildings. The story of that is, if you use that embodied carbon, you're replacing carbon to build more stuff when you don't need to. And although the link isn't exactly correlate to what things were built then and when they built now, it's definitely part of the story, I think, which needs telling, because you're just throwing carbon away for the sake of actually creating more carbon, and the story is keeping that means that your overall carbon at the end is less.
And even the parts that you strip down, we've proposed to take off the concrete sort of elements of the facades. They can be used within landscaping or paving or playgrounds. And equally, another project that we're working on, where we reclaim the bricks on site and crush them and do rammed earth, which means that you both have, you've reclaimed it in a different way, but you also sort of relate to what was once there on the kind of the palette of colour that people in the community have been used to.
Great. Okay, we've got time for maybe 2 more questions. Oh, I'm sorry, I was going that way. Sorry. So, man in the shirt at the back, and then Brian next. Yeah. Sorry.
Hi, thanks for that. It was absolutely fascinating. I suppose my question is regarding to the Carpenter and the Gascoigne estate. I can see that you're both suggesting provision of external amenity through projecting balconies is maybe slightly too technical as you're kind of working through it, but I wanted to see if you had tested how that would add additional load to existing structures and how practically resolvable you felt that was. And I can see that you're proposing different strategies, one with a jacket and I presume an external superstructure, which I can understand. And then on the Gascoigne estate, I think you're proposing to retain existing facades and then add balconies on the outside of the building. I was just wondering if you could elaborate on how achievable that is and how, whether it's been tested structurally.
We're looking at all this at the moment, so we're going through the technical stages of the project, so it's something that is particularly key, particularly within this economic climate that we find ourselves in now with rising costs and everything. On JRP, we've got an external structure, steel structure, that the existing structure can't take the new balcony load, so there's an external steel structure that's been bolted on that goes down into new pile foundations at the base of the building, and that provides the support for the new balcony structure. So that's been developed at the moment. Can't probably...
Well, the theory on the Gascoigne was that very much we're taking a lot of load off in terms of all the dead load of the masonry concrete on the side of the building, and yes, adding a steel frame off where we're creating extra space in the balcony. So that steel frame would have some additional foundations. If we established that the load going down to the existing foundations was greater than what was there, or greater than what could be accommodated as an increase, then we'd have to supplement it with existing foundations. But I think what we've shown there, from the base of the load removal and what we're putting back in terms of relatively short area of floor span, is actually going to be a lot lighter than what we're taking off. So it should be achievable.
And then, gentleman in the pink, this is our last question, I'm afraid.
I'm interested in the sort of conversations with residents, because retrofit is a much more complicated discussion with residents than historically estates. The messaging was quite simple: demolish everything, rebuild everything brand new, everyone gets new. Perhaps you could say something more about the kind of way in which you talk to residents with regard to what they individually were going to get versus maybe what was best for the estate. You know, if, say, someone was unhappy with their property, were they only offered a retrofitted version of their own property, or was there an opportunity to sort of horse trade and move around if people had different wants? And did they really believe retrofit was going to help, I suppose? That's a complicated question.
Should we start with Mellis?
It wasn't a demolish option. This was pure retrofit. So I think I'm just going to hand over to Harrison.
Thanks.
Yeah, I could think of something to say, but it doesn't really answer your question, because really we were talking about retrofitting existing properties, no additions. I just gave you a bit more thinking space there. There you go.
Again, really good question, and I think really we've gone a long way with residents, speaking to them about what they want through their homes, and I think it goes back to something that we talked about very early on about there being a fondness for the existing buildings on the estate already. So people remember when they moved into these originally, and it kind of lifted their aspirations, and they had all these new amenities. And so there's a little bit of a kind of thought process that with these new balconies and this new insulation that we're wrapping around them, people are going to get new homes that are very thermally efficient, and they've got all this amenity space on them as well. So there's a bit of a kind of excitement there. There's also a mix of housing that's going to be offered at Carpenters. So people that are living in apartments at the moment, they're likely to go into an apartment, whether that's a low-rise or a high-rise. The detail of that is still to be confirmed. There's also family housing as well, so it depends about what that tenant has got at the moment. It's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds, I think. Not quite there yet, but that will all kind of come in the next few years, I imagine.
No, I just one thing I think is in relation to the Gascoigne estate, where the initial sort of decanted residents didn't use their right to return because they didn't know what to expect of the new build. And I think it's similar with the retrofit. Once residents actually understand the quality of the retrofitted homes, they might appreciate them just as much, and they actually want to move back to their flat, basically. And I think we just need to showcase really good examples and show how good quality they can be. But there will always be a conversation. Are you in a new? It's like, is my retrofitted home as good as the new one across the street? We just have to prove that they are just as good.
Yeah, quite a lot of these buildings going back aren't at all. So maybe if someone's on the 12th story or the 16th story, they very much want to go back for their wonderful London views, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that piece on sharing, not just between audiences here and the sort of sharing about how you capture the data, but that sharing within the sort of audience, the consumer, the customer, the hearts and minds piece needs to happen as well, right? Well, thank you so much. Any final reflections, comments from you all, having heard each other's presentations, kind of heard what the audience has got to say? Any last thoughts from our panel?
I'm just really impressed with the provocation because, I know the client well as well. And I think that I really like that you're saying we sort of knew they weren't going to take it because they were already quite far on this project, but we're showing them something possible. And I'm very impressed that you took the time to study a case study to show everybody and others, I'm sure, the possibility, because I think that and that you're also showing the hiccups along the way, timber, difficult, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just impressed me. That's all. Yeah.
I would say, I think probably most of the architects in the room, you're probably doing it on your new build schemes, is the early stages, just count the embodied carbon, tell the client what it is. The ownership then, you're not making decisions, it's with the client. They've got that decision on embodied carbon, it sits with them. It shouldn't sit with designers. And so we need to go about that through retrofit and through new build, whatever we're doing. It's so important.
And I think just in the context of estates that we're conversation about today, it's really, taking on that neighborhood approach and totally embrace the landscape and public realm and not just look at the buildings, because everything around is just as important. The buildings are literally just the backdrop for where, at least the public sort of life happens.
And it's not just about the carbon, it's about the buildings and the social value of retaining those structures and having a memory of place and continuing that, I think. It makes a more interesting city.
Okay. Brilliant point to end on. So can we thank all of our speakers? And on behalf of the Building Centre, thank you all for attending this evening. We have been recording the event, so we'll publish it as soon as possible on the website, on the Retrofit 23 pages there, and also on our YouTube channel. So please do share it with people who couldn't make it tonight. We can continue the conversation upstairs for a little bit, so if you didn't get a chance to look around, you can take the next sort of 10-15 minutes to look around the gallery, and if you want to speak to some of our panellists directly upstairs, then take the time to do that. We also have lots more retrofit events. Next week we've got an online session on Tuesday lunchtime with ECD architects who Harrison worked with on the Carpenter's estate, so do sign up for that as well. And then our next in-person event is another Wednesday evening, the 12th of July, and we're looking at heritage and conservation issues in retrofit. So do keep in touch with the Building Centre, and thank you again for attending.